So today I'm going to be talking with you about evaluating the efficacy of service dog interventions, which is kind of what I eat, sleep, and breathe every day. So I'm just going to minimize myself so I don't see myself so much as I talk. All right. So I'm just going to center us on kind of the core elements of my field. And I think it's interesting to find out if that's, if this is the same introduction you always see at your own conferences as well. But typically I always start by talking about the biophilia hypothesis, which is the idea that as humans, we have this innate tendency to be drawn to animals in nature. But today we live in this hectic and technology-driven society, and we spend less time around animals in nature. And what drives my research is to understand what impact this has on our mental health and wellness. And one of my favorite examples of the biophilia hypothesis today is the zoo. So each year, millions of people travel and pay money just to stand there staring at animals. And in the US and Canada, at least, the number of people who go to the zoo is more than the number of people who go to all major professional sporting events combined. So it's a really pervasive cultural phenomenon, the fact that we want to seek out that contact any way that we can get it. And not only do we travel and pay money for that, but we also will allow companion animals to live in our homes. So I'm just going to give the US as an example, but in the US, 70% of households have a companion animal, or about over 90 million homes. And this is up from about 56% in 1988. So it's a growing phenomenon, or at least a stable one that is not going anywhere. And it's interesting because it's not cheap, right? So in 2020 in the US, $103.6 billion were spent on pets. And I don't know if you are pet owners, but I have a dog and she doesn't pay rent. She doesn't cook me dinner. She doesn't do anything that appears to be of utilitarian value. And yet I am delighted to, buy her toys, accessories, take her to the vet. And on the face of it, it's almost unclear, why are humans doing this? Is that a parasitic relationship, or is there something more that we can study? And one of the questions that comes out is, are there health benefits of these interactions? And one of the early studies that looked at this found that pet owners had about 1/3 the mortality rate of non-owners from recovering from coronary artery disease. And that was after controlling for the severity of the disease and socioeconomic factors. And this was the first study of this type that was published in a major medical journal. It was the first time that people started to take it a little more serious than, oh, they're cute and fuzzy, that's fine, but are there actual measurable health impacts? And that's my goal throughout my research, is to bring this to the mainstream, to medical journals, to psychology journals, to assess this with best line practices to see what the impacts can be. And really, the roles of dogs in our lives have continued to expand. Even as I've presented on this over the past maybe decade or so, it continues to change. The slides that I present show new roles for animals in our lives. So here are a few of the common roles of dogs in recent years. So we have therapy dogs, emotional support dogs, service dogs. Typically, I think people have in their mind that they're familiar with these, but I think it's important to look at the differences in the terminology. So therapy dogs are what you might see in a nursing home or a hospital. They come to visit and to provide support for many different people. Typically, that's an individual's pet who they volunteer with, but more recently, we have professional therapy dogs, which are called facility dogs. And these are dogs that go to work with someone every single day. It's their job as well to meet and support everyone in the hospital or the residential setting. Then we have emotional support dogs, which are medically prescribed to provide therapeutic benefits. And what they do is companionship, really. They are very different from service dogs, who are trained to do work or perform tasks to help with a disability. I know that those two can be confusing, and there's been a lot of drama around the nuance, but I just want to center us on the fact that service dogs have to be trained to do a specific task to help mitigate a disability. So what are some of the differences between these three? Now, I want to challenge you to try and answer this quiz as we go. I think, again, we all think this is obvious, but I have to say that I present about this far and wide, even to communities that should know these answers. And I think that people are surprised and need to familiarize themselves sometimes. So which category has full public access? The answer there is only service dogs. That's kind of the key distinguishing feature of a service animal. Can travel on commercial airlines? Again, only service dogs. It used to be until about a year or two ago, emotional support animals could also fly on planes, but that has changed in recent legislation. Can live in housing that does not allow pets? It's emotional support animals and service animals. So that's one where I think the emotional support animal stands out. That's their main distinguishing feature. I mean, what would be the point of going through the process to get an emotional support animal? If you live in rental housing or student housing that doesn't allow animals, legally they have to allow you to have your emotional support animal there. Which ones are registered or certified and have to carry identification? This one, there are nuances globally, so I'll go with the US here. But in the US, surprisingly, just therapy or facility dogs. I think people expect that service dogs would be the answer here, but there's no nationally registering body for service dogs in the US. It doesn't exist. You can't look someone up to see if they're legitimate. It's non-existent. And I think that's one where people do get confused. Whereas therapy and facility dogs, they are in hospitals and other settings where they are typically required to carry that registration or identification for insurance purposes. Species restrictions, that would be only service animals. So do you know which species are allowed to be service animals? The answer is dogs and miniature horses. The others do not have species restrictions. Which ones must wear a vest? This is another one that sometimes surprises people. None of them. None of them are legally required to wear a vest for identification. So just because a dog isn't wearing a vest doesn't mean they're not a service dog. Typically, it is helpful to communicate that, but it's not a legal requirement according to the Americans with Disabilities Act. Which ones must be professionally trained? And again, I hope you're taking this quiz as you go. The answer is none. That is one that also can be surprising, but individuals are legally allowed to obtain a dog and have them train them themselves to be a service animal. And I think the rationale behind that is to prevent discrimination for those that don't have resources to access professional training, but are able to do it themselves. And which ones must abide by behavior standards? The answer is therapy, facility, or service. Emotional support animals do not need to, and I can actually see the questions. Will the recording and slides be available to us? We'll have to ask our fearless leader about that one. That's a good question, but it would be fine with me. So basically, that's the main thing about emotional support dogs that sets them apart. And I think that's why there has been drama around them being on airplanes. The reason service animals have to abide by behavior standards is because they have full public access. So they can't be, going to the bathroom in public or growling in public. And same with therapy and facility animals. If they're in the hospital, those behaviors would not be appropriate. So that kind of concludes the table that I put together, and hopefully you did follow along and found some surprises that will inform kind of your interactions and your understanding of these categories. And I think that one of the reasons I wanted to go through this first is so that we would know and be on the same page when I talk about this research. And today I'm going to be talking to you about two categories. I'm going to talk about facility dogs, and I'm also going to talk about service dogs. There has been almost no research on emotional support dogs yet. There, a couple here and there, but it's largely unknown from a scientific perspective what the specific effects are of emotional support dogs. So today we are talking about, so let's go with service dogs first. So what are the purposes and roles of service dogs? This is kind of the last study that pulled together the specific frequency of different forms of service dog. So historically, we knew about guide and mobility dogs, but in recent years, we have seen a rise in psychiatric service dogs. They're actually the third most common type of service dogs being placed in the US and Canada. Now, these numbers are from 2014. If you know of a recent publication that tells this data, I have not seen it, and I'm tired of citing 2014. I assume it has changed and grown since then, but it gives a bit of the lay of the land. Now, why is it important to study efficacy of service dog interventions? The first is that these dogs are in high demand. On average, many organizations say their wait list is 2 years, and that has increased with demand and with COVID actually, and they can't accommodate all that are applying. So we need evidence to determine whether this is an efficacious intervention. Next, existing funding is limited. The funds needed to raise, train, and care for a service dog can exceed $20,000 per dog. I want to specify here that all the organizations I work with provide these dogs completely free of charge to the individual applying, but when they put together their costs, that's what they estimate the actual cost is. This one is really important to me. I think that clinicians need evidence-based expectations, and so do individuals applying. I mean, it's a multi-year commitment, and to go into this with little evidence or to recommend it with little evidence, we need to have expectations based in science that clinicians can provide, as they would with any other treatment that someone comes to their door asking for. Service dog teams also need public support. The general public relies on an understanding of how and why and when these dogs work to understand public access. And legislation relies on science as well to support public access. And finally, I think efficacy can be maximized if we study it to find out who benefits most, what type of dog is best, and which tasks are most helpful. So now that I've convinced you it's very important to study this, what have we been studying and what have we found? So I am a part of the Center for the Human-Animal Bond at Purdue University. And within my role there, we study many of these areas. And today I'm going to talk to you about PTSD service dogs, facility dogs in hospitals, and then a quick one slide at the end about our new project on service dogs for children with autism. So starting with PTSD service dogs, PTSD, I just want to center us around it in case you aren't familiar with it. It's very difficult to treat. So particularly when we look at military veterans, we find that only about half actually seek treatment. Of those that go to treatment, 20 to 40% will drop out. So the reason half might seek it, sometimes there's stigma around mental health. The reason they might drop out, treatment for trauma is basically exposure therapy is the frontline treatment. And I'm sure if you're familiar with that, even from the animal perspective, exposure to something traumatic is traumatic. So although it works well in efficacy studies in the real world, people don't want to show up to talk about and face their trauma, so they drop out. And of those who actually finish the course of treatment, 60% still maintain a diagnosis of PTSD. So we are by no means at the top of our game in terms of treating this disorder. And what that means is that we need to, yes, stick to these existing best practices. They work if you stick to them, but veterans are also seeking out complementary interventions. And that's where the service dog comes into play, to add to, not to replace existing treatments. And they're becoming increasingly popular. As I mentioned, these wait lists are extremely long, and organizations continue to pop up providing dogs for this purpose. So what do they actually do? First, on the left, I'll put the symptom, and on the right, I'll put what the dog can do. So one of the symptoms is experiencing anxiety or flashbacks or nightmares. The dog can, what we say, pause panic by nudging or licking during a flashback or a nightmare and bringing them back to the present. Individuals with PTSD feel hypervigilant, on edge, always could be startled. So the dog can help decrease that by watching their back or promoting calm. Just having them there makes the person feel like they aren't responsible for identifying anything scary. If, for example, if they're standing at the ATM, the dog can simply sit and face the other direction and let them know if someone's approaching so that they don't get startled. Negative thoughts and mood. What the dog can do is help decrease that depression by providing companionship, joy, and a sense of routine. So here is just a little video of what this looks like.
Nightmares are relentless. The anxiety is sometimes overwhelming. flashbacks can be brutal. But together, we give them hell.
So what I like about this video is that I feel like it shows how for someone without PTSD, that experience looks very everyday, walking into a store, hearing a leaf blower. But for the individual with PTSD, it's quite different. And the dog can do, you might turn them simple behaviors to bring that person back into the present, reduce that anxiety, and prevent panic attacks and further negative outcomes. So despite, this increase in popularity and anecdotally helping individuals, the research is severely lacking. The United States Department of Veteran Affairs, who is the deciding body kind of on what treatments are recommended, has specifically stated that clinically there's not enough research to determine if this works and whether or not we should support it. And Fiona asks a great question. Is there not overlap between service and companion as shown in the video? Absolutely. I think there is overlap. I don't think we can separate out completely, right? Because some of the benefits will simply be because of something that is inherently innate to the dog. And that's something that fascinates me specifically. And I will talk about a little bit later in the talk, is identifying which elements of efficacy are related to those trained tasks and which are related to other elements of the dog. What I will say, the one difference that even in this video we see is that the service dog has public access. So without that label, the dog would not be allowed in the store with that individual and thus not able to provide that companionship. So it's very nuanced. To be a service dog, you have to do a specific trained task, but perhaps when you are a service dog, other non-trained things are also being efficacious. So it's something we're still teasing apart and one that I'm pretty fascinated by. All right, so the first thing we did is started with a cross-sectional study. So we partnered with Canines for Warriors, which is the largest provider of PTSD service dogs in the United States. And our goal was to quantify the efficacy and role of psychiatric service dogs for military members and veterans with PTSD. I want to highlight my former PhD student, Carrie Rodriguez. She's now a postdoc at Colorado State University for her instrumental role in this work in our collaboration. So in this study, we had 141 individuals. About half of them were participating in unrestricted access to usual care and services. And roughly the other half were doing usual care plus a service dog. And to measure efficacy, we use standardized clinical assessment questionnaires as well as biological samples. So on the questionnaire piece, the first thing we did is compare PTSD symptoms. And we found that those with a service dog had clinically significantly lower PTSD symptoms. What I love about this graph is that some people look at it and say, wow, that looks like a big difference. And other people look at it and say, wow, that's all that it is. And I think both are correct. This difference that you see here is the same difference of our best frontline treatments, including CBT, exposure therapy, et cetera. But it's also not a cure. And I think that we need to recognize that. On the one hand, it's fascinating that a dog can create the same change as our frontline treatments. On the other hand, it's not a cure. We need all of our best practices, all of the tools in our toolkit to address this. Other differences that we see is that those with a service dog had better mental health, lower depression, significantly lower anger and anxiety. We also see significantly better well-being. That's one of my passions, is to not just study what's going wrong, but what's going right. Not just depression and anxiety, but positive mood increases, greater life satisfaction, and greater resilience. And finally, we see differences in social health. So less social isolation, more social participation. And this may have to do with that public access piece. You can get out into the world if you are able to be there with your service dog. And lastly, we saw less absenteeism at work due to health. So significantly less missing work from health if you have your service dog with you. And again, the workplace would be public access for the service dog. And got another chat. Is there a way to see if the type of person who would like to have a service dog, i.e. human personality, has an impact? Great question. And we, in our last study, did assess personality using the 10-item personality inventory. which is a really cool tool if you're not familiar with it yet. They've replicated it in humans and in animals to look at different personality types. So we don't have that answer yet. But I think what we're going to have to do, because we are currently only studying individuals who are interested in a service animal, we'll need to compare it to broader national data to see if there are differences. I'm not sure if there are in personality, but certainly, some people choose to have a companion animal, some people don't. There are differences in that, at least in that interest that motivate this. And in this study, we're really focused on people who would actually do this in the real world. So we're not studying anyone who hates dogs and wouldn't apply for this in the first place, because it wouldn't really be generalizable to them. And cultural differences as well. I think that's a great point by Fiona, that we absolutely need to look into that further. So those are the summary of a few of our clinical measures. In terms of biological samples, we looked at the cortisol awakening response. So cortisol is a stress hormone, and we were interested in the stress hormone physiology profile of our individuals. And we looked specifically at the cortisol awakening response. As you can see, that's where kind of the biggest variability across individuals happens in the day. This gray bar is what we see as a healthy awakening response. You're supposed to rise pretty sharply within 30 minutes after awakening. For individuals with PTSD, we see this blunted arousal. There's so much hypervigilance that they're not exhibiting that morning rise typically. So what we want to see is more of a healthy rise. So we had individuals in their homes throughout the US collect saliva immediately upon awakening, and then 30 minutes later. They did this protocol 2 days in a row. And here's a picture of one of our individuals taking this saliva. You can see it's so much fun. It's not weird at all when Purdue University asks you to collect your spit for science. I have to say, since COVID, I'm sure that people are more comfortable with this. But at the time that we collected this data, people were a little unused to this practice, but you can see he's having a great time. And what we found is that compared to those on the wait list, those of the service dog had a higher or more typical cortisol awakening response pattern, so a higher rise. So that was kind of our first step into identifying different physiological profiles of individuals that have a service dog in a cross-sectional design. The next step that we undertook was a clinical trial. So we received funding from 2 institutes from the NIH and registered a clinical trial on clinicaltrials.gov. We have just finished this, so I am going to present sort of preliminary, hot off the press data on this that certainly will go through many more phases before it hits publications. And also we're still processing each of our different data streams. So I'm just going to give you highlights from a few. So we did a parallel group longitudinal design. We assessed over a 3-month period. So at baseline and follow-up, each study period was 2 weeks long. Half of the sample had usual care alone, and the other half had usual care plus a service dog. One of the data streams that we used was ecological momentary assessment. So this is real-time data collection using a smartphone app where they're randomly pinged to ask how they're feeling, where they are, who they're with, etc. And this is supposed to be a higher level of accuracy than if I asked you over the past month, how was it? So, I mean, even if you just think to yourself now, 2 weeks ago on Monday, what did I eat for a snack at 4 p.m.? Whereas if I ping you exactly at that time, we should have a higher level of accuracy and detail. So this is, again, just the quick first stab at looking at this data. And what we see is these are changes from baseline to 3 months follow-up. The service dog group is showing significant increases in positive emotions from baseline to follow-up, but the control group is not. And with negative emotions, we see the opposite pattern, that there are significant declines in negative emotions for the service dog group, but not the control group. So that's pretty interesting and exciting to see that there may be this daily emotional change that's occurring on a moment-to-moment level. The next thing that we looked at is actigraphy in human canine dyads. So you can see here that the human is wearing a wristband and so is the dog. Well, the dog in the form of a collar. So for the human, we use the Actigraph. For the dog, we use the whistle, and we're interested not only in their sleep and activity levels, but also co-regulation. So how do these dyads co-regulate? Is a higher level of synchronicity related to a higher level of bond and more positive outcomes? Now that I've gotten you excited about that, I will say that we don't have that full answer yet, but I'll tell you what we've done with the data so far. But a lot of data processing, cleaning, and syncing to happen before we can fully get there. But this is one of the pieces that gets me excited about the animal-computer interaction piece, because I think there are some parallels and some ways that I certainly can enhance my work through collaboration, hopefully. So this first piece, my PhD student, Claire Jensen, delved into a few specific questions. I feel like I'm hearing someone who's not on mute. I hope they're not mute. Okay. Identify that and go ahead and mute. So Claire led answering 3 specific questions. The first is, how often do veterans use trained tasks? How much time do they spend? Oh, they're on mute now. Thank you. That's very kind. How much time do they spend in proximity with one another? Oh, thank you for doing that on their behalf. And finally, are these things, trained task usage and time spent together, related to PTSD severity? So these were the questions that Claire dove into. So we use that ecological momentary assessment to look at task usage. So a little bit more specifics on this. These are check-ins that happened twice a day. They were randomly timed, and they occurred for 14 days in a row at baseline and again at follow-up. And the question that she looked at was, in the past 4 hours, which trained service dog tasks did you use? So we asked about 5 specific trained tasks. Interrupt or alert to anxiety. When the individual is about to have a panic attack or is anxious, the dog interrupts, alerts them to it so they can recover. The next one is calm comfort to anxiety. Might look like the same thing. The difference here is that the human initiates in this case. They identify in themselves, I'm feeling anxious, and they ask the dog for assistance. Watch their back, again, just kind of letting them know if someone's approaching. Creating space in public so that they feel safer. And then the task to make a friend. So if you want to engage with someone, you can let the dog know it's okay to go ahead and make a friend now with the other person. The time with the service dog was measured via Bluetooth proximity. So we used the whistle on the dog collar, and it was synced with the veteran's smartphone. And there was a ping that was sent between the device and the phone every 10 minutes. So we calculated time with the service dog as the number of minutes together over the total number of minutes. So in this particular piece of the data set, we had 65 dyads. The humans were on average 37 years, and about 80% or more were males. The dogs were on average 2 years old, 65% male, 65% mixed breed, and 55% from rescues or shelters. And that's something I will say is unique to this provider. Some providers have a purpose-bred model. They breed dogs for this purpose. Some providers source from shelters. And in this case, we found that interesting because it provides variability that we hope to study. So what we found is the most common task was that calm comfort to anxiety by a lot. So 53% reported in the past 4 hours having used calm comfort to anxiety, and that is the human initiated request for help from the dog. Followed by make a friend, interrupting or alerting to anxiety, the dog initiated task, block or create space, and cover or watch back, all sort of in the same range. Next, we looked at how much time they spent together. So 82% of their time was within Bluetooth proximity to their dogs. And I want to, state the nuance. This is proximity between the dog collar and the veteran's phone. So there may be some data that has to do with where their phone is, but on average, 82%, a range of 53 to 98% of time spent together. And for context, 82% is approximately 20 hours a day spent together. So PTSD severity was not related to time together or most trained tasks. The only thing that in this initial analysis came out was that interrupt or alert to anxiety. So PTSD was related to that task, and that is the dog-initiated interrupting or alerting to anxiety task. And this is kind of our first stab at answering that question of, are the tasks the important piece? And if so, which ones? And as we move forward in this area of studying service dog efficacy, I've sort of developed a framework for how I want to study this, and also informs our next step. We have a new R01 from the NIH to do another clinical trial on this to look at more elements. And so the way I sort of frame it is you have the human-animal dyad, and then 3 different areas that we're looking at. So the first is long-term efficacy. And so for that, we quantify the outcomes. So are there differences in symptomology, socio-emotional functioning, or other areas such as sleep or nightmares? The second element are the mechanisms. What are the mediators? And we really want to look at this from a theoretical approach. So is it the biophilia hypothesis? Are there physiological changes related to arousal regulation? Is it attachment theory related? Does it have to do with the bond, to synchronicity and co-regulation? Or is it potentially social support theory? When we look at social relationships, is the dog increasing social relationships, and that's what's driving change? So we had a lot of questions about how this is working. And finally, what are the moderators? How can we predict success? So we can look at human attributes, potentially the personality indicators, potentially other psychometric profiles. Is it the canine attributes? Are there some dogs that are really driving better outcomes? Is it one of the first characteristics that we're seeing positive findings from is excitability, less excitable dogs leading to more positive outcomes? And is it the provider model? This is an interesting space. Not all providers do this the same, right? There's the shelter model, there's the purpose-bred model. There's also different training techniques. There's different follow-up protocols. So many characteristics go into this. And I hope that this is a model that can drive our future research on any sort of service dog or therapy animal intervention as we narrow in and kind of reach the level of rigor of other types of interventions. And these are all, of course, interrelated. So that is more information on the PTSD service dog intervention research that we've been doing, as well as the model that I hope to see for the next piece. And I will go to hospitals next, but I see a question. Can you also mention the challenges and risks that service dogs working with PTSD patients may be facing? Is this currently being monitored by anyone? Thank you for that question. And I think that's such an important avenue to talk about challenges and risks. I would say, and now I'm guilty of it as well, because in today's talk, I tried to go high level and just talk about the key, positive pieces, but I think we really need to talk about those challenges and those risks, and we need to be monitoring them. So in our study, we did monitor challenges, risks, and drawbacks. And drawbacks is the piece that came out most prevalent. I would say that the biggest drawback that people mention is that before this was an invisible disability, and now people are addressing them and making a deal out of it when they're in public. From the dog side, I think that the welfare piece is very important, and we need to be what they do to manage that really is a lot of screening. They have a really rigorous application process to get these dogs, and they hope that that is predictive. And then they have several follow-ups. I think 30 days, 60 days, 3 months, 6 months, a year, to check in and see if there are any challenges. So that's done at the provider level, and then we're doing it in our trial. So I hope that's an initial answer to your question. If there's specific challenges or risks that you are curious about, let me know. But I think the main path is prevention, selecting the right dog, selecting the right human, and then monitoring over time. All right, so a couple more chats. So we see, thanks. Then we've got a question from Mia, who I know from Australia. Hi, Mia. Funding is often tied to human outcomes and historically hasn't required canine welfare measures to be reported. Exactly. There was a recent paper on that. Mia might even be an author on it. And it's very true. We have such limited data on the canine welfare outcomes due to the fact that the funding is related to the human outcomes. And I think and hope it's a growing trend to focus on both sides. I think more funding calls are asking for both. So hopefully we have better data moving forward. Is it possible, next question, is it possible to train unwanted dogs, or is it too late if they're not puppies? So in this particular provider we work with, they are using, I guess, unwanted dogs by someone. So animals that have been relinquished to a shelter, they do a screening, and any that have, behavioral profiles that might be amenable to being a service dog, they bring to their facility, train them, and then rehome them as a service dog. So in this model, they say it's not too late, but they are not using older dogs. Everyone is starting with, I can't say everyone, but most organizations are starting with younger dogs. And I don't know if it's not necessarily because older dogs couldn't be, strong in this role, but there is something to be said for the working life of the animal, and that it will be longer if you start younger. And so for the individual with PTSD, getting to partner, bond, and work with that dog for, 7, 8 years instead of 1 to 2 years is going to make a difference on their end as well. Great questions, everyone. All right, so let's see. Thanks. You are welcome. On the hospital piece, so I mentioned that we were also going to talk about facility dogs. So that is what I'm going to talk about next. These are what you might call professional therapy dogs. Go to work every day, or depending on their schedule, they might be part-time, and are in this setting with an individual. So in this piece of the work, we worked with the service dog provider Canine Assistance. This is an example of one of their dogs in a pediatric oncology unit. And this is what it might typically look like, receiving that soft comfort and support from a familiar species. Now, what's interesting is I feel like a lot of people look at this picture and they expect that I'm going to talk about this sweet girl in the bed. And a lot of research does focus on that. But what we were interested in was actually pulling out this individual, our pediatric hospital personnel, because they are facing this day in and day out, and it is so stressful. And the rates of burnout are high because they're having to have tough conversations with parents of children who may be terminally ill, and watch this every day. And for that, we wanted to find out, for that person who has a facility dog, does that make a difference for them? So we know that pediatric hospital personnel are at risk for burnout due to the factors that I described and the challenges and the heavy things that they are facing every day in their work. And we know that, stemming from that, burnout can lead to adverse outcomes. So from that burnout, we see increased risk for depression, exhaustion, and relationship troubles. There's also medical impacts, reduced patient satisfaction, reduced quality of care, and increased medical mistakes. And finally, there are financial elements. There's staff turnover. It is hard to stay in this role for a long time if you are burnt out, and higher rates of absenteeism. So all of these things are a great challenge to this industry. And we have strong science indicating that human social support can make a positive difference to these elements. So what we wanted to find out is, from this model, could a dog, through potentially that social support theory, have an impact on these outcomes? So we partnered with children's hospitals throughout the US through the service dog provider. These are examples of the children's hospitals that we worked with. And we had 131 pediatric hospital personnel participate. So in the one group, again, it was a cross-sectional design. In the one group, we had facility dog handlers, so professionals that work with a dog. In the other group, they worked on a similar unit, but did not have a dog. So we matched these pairs on their position in the hospital, their gender identity, age, and whether or not they had pets in the home. So we had 65 individuals in each group, and their demographics, their position were 74% were actually in 2 categories: child life specialists and administrative staff. Gender was very predominantly female identifying. Age, on average, 38 years, but you can see we had a bit of a large standard deviation. And pet ownership, 76% own pets separate to the service dog, or sorry, facility dog. The study measures that we used, we did, again, clinical measures through surveys, ecological momentary assessment, and in this study, we also had the dogs wear the whistle to look at proximity. We are still processing the second two pieces, so today I'm going to talk to you about our survey measures. And the first thing that we found is that participants with a facility dog had greater feelings of accomplishment at work. So I do like to show the full scale of the graph, so it may look like a smaller difference at the top, but it was significant, the difference in their feelings of accomplishment at work. Interestingly, there were no differences in emotional exhaustion. And I like this for two reasons. I guess I don't like the outcome, but I like to have this differential validity in the fact that they're not answering that everything is better. But there are some things that aren't, and we need to identify those so that we can manage expectations, so that people don't go in expecting everything will change, everything will get better. Part of the reason we do this research is to identify both areas of significance as well as areas that are not different. And emotional exhaustion, I think, is particularly interesting because what we find is that individuals who have a facility dog are so much more popular. They might even have an increased caseload in cases because everyone's asking them for help. And so it's important to know, if you want to pursue this, that you're not going to be less emotionally exhausted likely. What we do see is a lower job turnover intention. And that's one that's important to the hospitals when they think about, is this a worthwhile endeavor to have a dog on our unit? If your staff are less likely to want to quit, that's compelling. In terms of emotions, just as a final piece, those with a facility dog felt more positively about their recent experiences. So we are seeing an emotional element as well. So those are just a few of our initial findings on the facility dogs in hospitals. And finally, I promised one slide on our new study on service dogs for autism. And in this study, we worked with the service dog provider Canine Companions. And one of the things that I'm excited we did in this study is we did sort of a branding and study name to get people engaged. So this was the Purdue CARES Canines for Autism Research Study. And it was actually a lot of fun for the families who participated to get to be a part of. And the initial finding that we're seeing significance is that there are parent-reported differences in child sleep. So that is one that I definitely think is amenable to more objective monitoring in the future, but the children are able to go to bed in their room by themselves and wake up less, which if you are not a parent or someone who doesn't appreciate sleep, that might not sound that meaningful, but in terms of the impact that can have on overall functioning, we're seeing big changes, and we're excited to follow that one up more specifically. So these are just three highlight areas that we work on. We worked on service dogs for other areas as well, such as mobility, medical alert, and it's been really meaningful to get to work with these groups and individuals to help to share their stories through science in a way that builds evidence around what they're doing and also identifies areas of significance and non-significance so that we can manage expectations and inform clinicians and people hoping to pursue these. We also do ask questions about drawbacks in every single study, and I think that will be important as we explore that data to help further manage expectations. So I just wanted to thank very immensely our partners and funders, the service dog providers, and the supporters of our research on these many different streams. It would not be possible without them, and we are so grateful. And if you are interested in this and want to learn more, you can check out our research website at humananimalinteraction.org. I try and post our papers as they come out, as well as graphical abstracts and news articles. So feel free to look for more or reach out to me. But with that, I just want to thank you so much for your time, and I welcome any questions if you have any.